The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of 8 News Now or Nexstar Media Group.
It is no longer a party, it's a socialist party now.
Tonight on Politics Now, switching parties. North Las Vegas Mayor John Lee tells us why he has decided to become a Republican. Plus,
you have a trio of candidates that really bubbled to the surface.
It's a year and a half away, but the 2022 governor's race is starting to take shape. We speak with Las Vegas Review-Journal editor Steve Sebelius about Sheriff Joe Lombardo throwing his hat into the ring. And from stopping federal agents to expanding voter access and regulating home births, we take you through the week at the legislature.
From 8 News Now, this is Politics Now.
We thank you very much for joining us here on Politics Now. I'm John Langler. Clark County Sheriff Joe Lombardo has confirmed this week he is considering running for governor. Lombardo told the Review-Journal he's kicking the tires on a run. Although sheriff is a nonpartisan position, Lombardo, if he does run, says he would run as a Republican. Sources tell our I-Team he is talking with fellow Republicans, Congressman Mark Amodei, former Lieutenant Governor Mark Hutchison, about picking one of those three candidates and then supporting them. We'll get into that a little bit later on in our interview with Steve Sebelius from the RJ. North Las Vegas Mayor John Lee announced this week he is switching parties. He's now a Republican.
I've been thinking about it for quite a while, as seeing the way the country's been going, watching what's happened in national news, and also seeing the responses that take place within our state. And when the socialists took over the Democratic Party, it was a sign to me that there is no more Democratic Party that I thought I understood 20, 25 years ago.
Mayor is a nonpartisan office here in Nevada, but Lee was registered as a Democrat when he served in the legislature and when he ran for Congress. That socialist takeover he's referring to, that is members of the Democratic Socialists of America that won positions and control essentially of the state Democratic Party. Lee's current term runs out in 2022, but he did not say if he plans to run for higher office.
I think that sometimes if one person will stick their head up and say, it's time, we can't continue to go down this path any further, that possibly that changes the decisions of a lot of other people just to follow, waiting for someone to say, which way do we go? I hope a lot of people will pay attention to this and say, I understand the way to go. I would like people to come with me because Nevada is too dang important for all of us.
Lee's referring to trying to get voters to go with him to the Republican Party. Now, we did reach out to the Nevada Democrats for a comment on this. We did not get a response. So back to that race for governor. It is starting to shape up for 2022. Perhaps John Lee will be involved. It does appear incumbent Democrat Steve Sisolak will run again. I spoke with Las Vegas Review-Journal politics editor Steve Sebelius about how those races are shaping up. I'll point out, though, this interview happened before Joe Lombardo said he was considering running.
You asked about governor. On the Democratic side, obviously Steve Sisolak is the incumbent, and he is planning to run for re-election, or at least all indications are at this point that he's going to plan to run for re-election. There have been some whispers that he's not going to do it, but I happen to think that if that was the case, he probably would have said so. Maybe if shortly after the legislative session concludes, he'll say so if he's not planning to do it. But right now, all indications are that he is going to run. So there you have the Democratic side. Now on the Republican side, there's something interesting going on that you don't always see. You have a trio of candidates that really bubbled to the surface, and those candidates are Representative Mark Amodei of the 2nd District, lives up in Reno, the former Lieutenant Governor Mark Hutchison, who is also a former state senator, and Clark County Sheriff Joe Lombardo. They both live down here in southern Nevada. And what's interesting and somewhat unprecedented is that those three are talking. They're having conversations behind the scenes with each other, basically on the premise of, look, a Republican primary where we all run against each other, spend all the money, and come out wounded and poor is not in the best interest of the party. So we need to agree amongst ourselves who is the best candidate, and then that person will run without having to deal with a Republican primary with high name contenders. There's going to be probably some people who get in who you've never heard of, but just the top people. And so those three are the names that we hear most often.
There's some other names besides those three that you're hearing might jump in, understanding that it's still a long way away?
It is still a long way away, and there are some other names. Interestingly enough, Dean Heller has been mentioned. He wanted to run for governor before, but he deferred to Adam Laxalt. I think he may regret that decision now, given that Laxalt performed so poorly in the general. But we still assume, regardless of that performance, that Adam Laxalt will perform well in a Republican primary. So he is going to be a formidable candidate, regardless of which race he chooses. Right now, it looks like he's going to run for Senate if he wants to do that. Can a moderate Republican, someone such as a Mark Hutchison or a Ben Kekeffer, win a Republican primary? What does the Trump base do? In Adam Laxalt's case, we know what they'll do. They'll turn out and vote for Laxalt, no question. But a moderate, is that person going to get support in a Republican primary? That's an open question, and that could really affect some of the candidates here.
On the Democratic side, obviously, as you mentioned, there's Steve Sisolak. He's the incumbent. He is a Democrat. You mentioned he's in all likelihood going to run again. But is it possible, given the recent changes with the Nevada Democratic Party, that he could be primaried?
It is possible. I have heard more than once from more than one person the name Marilyn Kirkpatrick as a potential candidate for governor. She's done a really good job as chairwoman of the Clark County Commission, and I think she might have aspirations to do that. I think that might be less likely. You mentioned the Democratic Party and whether or not a progressive candidate, a more liberal candidate in the mold of Bernie Sanders, would challenge Steve Sisolak for governor. I tend to think that is probably not likely.
That, of course, Steve Sebelius, political editor at the Las Vegas Review-Journal, a familiar face here at 8 News Now. We have our entire discussion online. We also talk about the race for Senate. It's over at 8newsnow.com. Nevada's Secretary of State's office reports a slight dip in active voter registrations from March. There was a decrease of 642 voters. Nevada has 1.8 million active registered voters now. Every political party saw a slight decrease in registration, the only bump in nonpartisan voters. That increased by nearly 5,400. Now to the legislative session. Friday was a key deadline in Carson City. Bills had to make it out of their first committee. Now we're going to go through a lot of those next week on Politics Now, but for now, let's look at a few hearings on bills this week. One bill that keeps local law enforcement from cooperating with federal immigration officials has now moved out of committee. That happened this week. This is Assembly Bill 376. It is sponsored by Democrat Assemblywoman Selena Torres. Among other things, this would keep law enforcement from putting immigration holds on people without a federal warrant. It would also limit when police could ask someone their immigration status. Nevada's Republican Party opposes the measure. The Republicans say 90% of people arrested for being in the country illegally had outstanding criminal charges. Metro Police suspended their coordination program with ICE back in 2019. Democrats in Carson City hope a proposal to expand automatic voter registration might help clean up the voter rolls. Assembly Bill 432 would allow more government agencies to help county clerks automatically register voters. This would include Medicaid and other state agencies because, quite simply, not everybody goes to the DMV. The bill is sponsored by Assemblyman Howard Watts. He says this would help prevent fraud.
First of all, I think the rampant voter fraud is a myth. But this prevents unintentional registration of people who might not be eligible to vote. So the safeguards are in place in this policy. And what we're doing is building on those and expanding those.
Judges have repeatedly thrown out allegations of voter fraud in Nevada. If passed, this measure would cost Nevada several $1 million to update computer systems for automatic voter registration. The Secretary of State's office says there are concerns about that installation. The state's health exchange says it would cost about $6 million to put this measure into place, close to $10 million for all of the state agencies combined. Lawmakers are also considering whether there should be licensing and oversight for midwives and home births here in Nevada. Right now, only one type of midwife is regulated. Those are certified nurse midwives that are registered nurses already with the state. However, there is no oversight of traditional midwives and certified professional midwives, and many don't have medical training. Assembly Bill 387 is sponsored by Democrat Assemblywoman Danielle Monroe Moreno. It would create oversight of this practice. Opponents of the measure say any regulation would take away a woman's choice about where she can give birth and who can care for her. The first hearing was on Monday.
Licensure is a key to providing safe care for Nevadans that is consistent with the scope of practice defined by the profession.
We cannot support a bill that will decrease the midwifery labor workforce in Nevada, negatively impact future workforce development, detract from Nevada's historical support of apprenticeship trades.
There is also a Senate bill under consideration on this. You can check out the I-Team's full reports on the issue at 8newsnow.com. Coming up next on Politics Now, expanding voting access or not. Coming up, we're going to hear from Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen and Republican leader Mitch McConnell on some measures being considered.
Hay choices from El Pollo Loco.
Welcome back to Politics Now.
Nye County plans to be the first part of Nevada to lift a mask mandate. Commissioners are also expecting to go to 100% capacity in businesses. So right now, the state mask mandate is still in effect. Control of coronavirus plans and restrictions, that gets turned over to the counties statewide May 1st. So on that day, Nye County plans to make those changes. Commissioners voted this week on this measure. They say the county's infection rate is between 5 and 7% and the cases have remained flat. But they're still encouraging people to wear masks. The state board will review and approve the reopening plan later this month. The race for Clark County Commission District C, it is still surprisingly unsettled, at least according to Republican candidate and Las Vegas City Councilman Stavros Anthony. His lawyers brought a lawsuit over the election before the state Supreme Court. Oral arguments began this week. You'll remember Anthony lost the District C County Commission race in November to Democrat Ross Miller. Clark County commissioners first suggested they would hold a special election, but then they backed down from that. The court's expected to take several months before issuing a ruling. Battles over new voting rules in Georgia and other states has put congressional legislation at the forefront. Democrats are pushing H.R. 1, which they've dubbed the For the People Act. Democrats say it would expand voter access. President Joe Biden is pushing his party to get it to his desk. The I-Team's David Charnes asked Nevada Senator Jackie Rosen if she supports the bill.
The For the People Act, we have legislation here in Nevada to expand voting. We also have legislation that is likely not going to pass because it doesn't have the numbers to restrict voting. And then nationally, we have the For the People Act to, solidify some of voting rights. What's your stance on that right now?
My stance is this, is that it is a bedrock of our democracy that every vote counts, that we tell everyone your voice is your vote. And so I want to be sure that everyone has equal access to the ballot box all across America. This is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This is an American issue. The world is watching. And so there's been no evidence of voter fraud. We need to be sure that we have equitable access to the ballot box everywhere. So everyone who's eligible to vote has the right to make their voice heard. And the world is watching how we do that.
Is there anything in the bill that you wouldn't support right now, or I mean, I know it's early, but is there something in it that you'd like to see or you haven't seen?
Well, you know what? They're still working on all the final languages between the House and the Senate version, so we'll see what that actually comes down to as people begin to discuss it.
Nevada's other Democratic Senator, Catherine Cortez Masto, also supports the For the People Act. Republicans oppose the bill. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell laid out why on March 25th.
It would forcibly rewrite every state's election laws in ways that defy common sense and are deeply unpopular with American voters. It would mandate nearly unrestricted same-day registration. It would mandate big loopholes that would render voter ID almost meaningless. It would make every state legalize ballot harvesting, where paid operatives can turn up carrying big piles of ballots with other people's names on them. Zero chain of custody. Democrats want to hide behind the mantle of voting rights. What they're really proposing is less security, less integrity, and a grab bag of changes that are deeply, deeply unpopular. Just look at the other changes with zero relationship to voting rights that Democrats want to smuggle in behind that smokescreen. This bill would take the Federal Election Commission from an evenly split bipartisan panel to a partisan body so that Democrats could rule unilaterally.
So far, a vote on H.R. 1 has not been scheduled on Capitol Hill. Coming up next on Politics Now, we're going to check in with our Washington, D.C. bureau.
President Joe Biden announces a set of executive actions to curb gun violence. I'm Basil John reporting in Washington. We have the latest on the announcement.
As the weather warms up, more Americans want to travel and gather. But will a vaccine passport be necessary? I'll have the latest from the White House.
At redcrossblood.org for more information. You're watching Politics Now.
This week, President Joe Biden announced a set of executive actions to curb gun violence here in the U.S. Washington, D.C. correspondent Basil John reports on this latest announcement.
Gun violence in this country is an epidemic.
Thursday, President Joe Biden issued new executive actions he says will improve gun safety.
We have an opportunity to fulfill the first responsibility of government, to keep our people safe.
President Biden's actions will create tighter regulations around guns assembled from kits and pistols with a stabilizing brace, as well as direct the Justice Department to publish red flag legislation that can be adapted by states.
Just like with background checks, the vast majority of the Americans support these extreme risk protection order laws. And it's time to put these laws on the books and protect even more people.
But Republicans say this is not the right way for the president to tackle gun violence.
He's not holding people accountable for their actions. He's holding innocent people accountable for the actions of people who are violent.
Pennsylvania Republican Congressman Fred Keller says the violence doesn't come from the guns, but from bad individuals.
You're not going to solve that problem until you get to the root cause and stop talking about the instrument somebody uses and talk about what causes that behavior.
Keller says the issue should be left up to Congress, but the president says curbing gun violence requires taking action.
Whether Congress acts or not, I'm going to use all the resources at my disposal as president to keep the American people safe.
Reporting in Washington, I'm Basil John.
Bills with similar regulations are being considered at the legislative session here in Nevada. Assembly Bill 286 bans those home-assembled firearms kits, the ghost guns we just heard about. It's the second most commented bill so far. More than 2,800 comments, in fact, 2,400 against it, 400 for it. Nevada also previously passed a law allowing family members, household members, and police to get a court order seizing someone's gun for up to a year. Countries are beginning to implement vaccine passports, both for their own citizens and for tourists from other countries. The question is, will America be next? Some private industries are already moving in that direction. The travel industry supports the idea, but governors in some red states are saying no.
Most people want to travel, and they don't care if they have to show one more ID.
It's completely unacceptable for either the government or the private sector to impose upon you the requirement that you show proof of vaccine.
Plenty to talk about from Washington, D.C. That's why we have Alexandra Limon there with some of the headlines right now. Let's start talking with vaccine passports. Some areas have already implemented them, New York City most notably. What is the latest guidance from the Biden administration on putting these in place?
Well, we've heard from the White House a couple of times now on this issue, and they've been pretty consistent and adamant as well in saying that it will not be the federal government that implements any type of mandate requiring a vaccine passport or requiring vaccination in general for people to do different types of public activities. But they also say they do recognize, like you mentioned, that the private sector, maybe even states or cities, may implement some sort of vaccine requirement or vaccine passport requirement in order to allow people to travel or to attend really big public events like sporting events. And so because they recognize it's likely going to happen in one form or another, the White House does say they will help to develop a system that they say will hopefully be fair and accessible to everyone, and also safe, to make sure, you know, that people's personal safety information isn't being jeopardized to hackers or not at risk to be leaked out to the public.
In some places across the country, they're trying to mandate that you can't have these vaccine passports. What's happening in some of the states across the country?
Well, in some states, we're seeing governors sign executive orders or new laws that say that any state agencies or tax-funded agencies cannot require any type of vaccine passport or vaccination proof. But in one state, in Florida, the governor there has actually gone a step further and is requiring that even private businesses not be allowed to ask people to require proof of vaccine. And that's going to be a little tricky. It'll be interesting to see whether or not Governor DeSantis can move forward with that. Because, for example, there's a lot of international travel that happens in and out of Florida, whether it be by air or cruise ships that go to places that are now starting to require that tourists have vaccine passports, places like Iceland and Greece, for example.
And that was Alex Limon from Washington, D.C. More politics now after this.
Go Tires, the team you trust.
You're watching Politics Now.
Nevada's congressional delegation's been in southern Nevada this week pitching the American Rescue Plan. On Thursday, a group of Democrats gathered up in North Las Vegas at a food bank there. Senators Jackie Rosen, Catherine Cortez Masto, Congresswoman Susie Lee and Dina Titus, and Congressman Stephen Horsford were all there taking part in the food bank. More videos are out from the government investigation into unidentified flying objects. This was revealed by our own George Knapp this week. It shows a group of flying pyramids floating above a Navy warship. The video clip is part of a briefing prepared by the Pentagon's UAP task force, which is working on a comprehensive report for Congress about the UFO mystery. If you would like to learn more about this and the Pentagon's task force, just head over to MysteryWire.com. You can check out the story there and a whole lot more about UFOs and flying pyramids. Thank you very much for watching Politics Now this week. You can stay up to date online, of course, at 8newsnow.com. We're back with you next Saturday with the latest from Carson City and Washington, D.C. Take care.